Tim Pernetti is the commissioner of the American Athletic Conference. He's a former college athlete, a former athletic director at Rutgers. He is a guy who's worked in the media world, one of these 40 under 40 types when he was 40 under 40. He'll be joining us for a 2-on-1 interview today to talk about all things college athletics, a bunch of chaos out there and big decisions that still need to be made. And Wilner, why Tim Pernetti? Why now?
Well, I think there's a couple pieces to this. One is just the timing. We're about a week away from the Big Ten and the SEC having a summit. We're a couple weeks away from the next CFP meetings, which he's a part of as a commissioner. So there's a lot of news to ask him about. But I also feel like there's so much going on, and he has such a varied background as you walked us through, right? That it makes sense. Somebody with that sweep of experiences is probably better able to make sense of the chaos than someone who has got a much more narrow perspective. And I'm not sure there's anybody, any college conference commissioner at this point maybe has a more varied background than Tim Pernetti.
And there's also questions about the Pac-12, who came after a couple of his schools and how he was feeling, how he handled that. But also, you look at everybody but the Big Ten and the SEC. How important is it for everybody else to band together and create some leverage, or at least, as long as they're having a summit, or, can you have a summit? So I want to dive into all of that and a whole bunch more. Without further ado, let's get to it.
All right, Tim, thanks a ton for doing this, man. Appreciate it. And I just have been wondering, right? You're at Rutgers, and then you're out of college sports. You're off the front lines, right? You're at IMG, MLS, 10 years, and now you are dropped back down in the middle of this storm. Like, how do you get your bearings coming in to the middle of this, right?
All right, well, listen, first of all, thank you guys for having me. I'm avid followers of both of your stuff, and it's great to be here. And listen, a lot of people that I love and trust that I worked with and mentored me throughout my career literally called me and were like, what are you, out of your mind? Like, you're going back to college sports? But I think what you said is an important part of it, because I was really lucky along the way in my career, guys, because I worked on the media side most of my career in TV, and on the business side, like Tony Petitti worked 10 feet across the hall from me when I was a young programming executive at ABC Sports. But seeing it from the media side, and then getting to do a startup when I did CSTV years ago, which was a great project, which was college sports focused, and then getting to work on a campus, and like perfect storm, you work on your alma mater's campus.
Yeah.
It was just really, really special to me. But I'd seen it from pretty much every angle. And then when I took over IMG College and ran the commercial side for 100-something schools, I knew that side of it too. But this is one role that I just had never seen it from. So I have not gotten my bearings yet completely, but what I will tell you is I had my eyes open coming in. The industry is not without its challenges right now, but I actually think that's what makes the opportunity really exciting. Like, within chaos, there's often a lot of opportunities to try to do some things differently and modernize.
You're at Rutgers when, obviously Rutgers comes into the Big Ten and makes that transition. Looking back on that, I think we've seen a whole bunch of realignment since then. And, what was that like, and what was that onboarding like, and did it work how you thought it would?
John, that prospect was why I took that job, because, I'd been around ADs enough to know that I didn't want an AD job. There's just something about it just didn't click with me. When Rutgers called, I remember getting excited about it, because I thought to myself, I've worked on the media side for so long, and what this school doesn't understand is they're not trotting out their best asset, which is New York. And Jim Delaney and I spoke the night before I got hired, because I'd known him for years. And I said to him, if I get this job, what do you think the chances are at getting Rutgers in the Big Ten? And I remember he said, you've been talking to me about that for years. The chances are less than 5%. I remember saying something like, well, that's not zero, but it started a quest that I spent 4 years on, trying to get that deal done, and just building the narrative about New York and creating this competitive tension about who was going to access the market. It was a professional pinnacle to get it done, especially because it was my alma mater. The onboarding, I did some of it, but I was out not that long after, in the midst of that basketball mess. But the onboarding, I think, was a little bumpy. But as far as like where they are and what the result has been, I expected it to be hugely challenging. I told people, like, be careful what you wish for. Football could be a process, but I did expect sports like basketball with the right coach, and wrestling who had the right coach, and what they've done in lacrosse and other sports to be successful. And they're competing at a really high level. And the business side is the Big Ten accessed, $500 million in new revenue per year by capturing New York, that they've been able to share that wealth across the conference. Like we talked about all the, AAU and institutional fit, all true, but that deal was a media contract. I mean, you face facts.
And so when you look at the Big Ten now, from your perspective at the American, are you worried at all about, and we're recording roughly a week before the SEC and Big Ten are supposed to meet for their second summit, right? And then we've got the CFP meetings. Are you worried at all about where this whole thing's headed with those two conferences kind of taking the lead?
John, I'm not worried.
Okay.
I think everybody is just curious.
Yeah.
Right. And the one thing, it's interesting, like when I started years, if you flash back when I was a young TV guy, I was in the room and got to know all these. I got to know Commissioner Kramer and Mike Slive and Tony and John Swafford and Tom Hansen at the Pac-10, and Jim Delaney. And that was kind of the room I grew up in. And what I always was amazed by was they were all fighting for their conference. But when it was time to move the enterprise forward, everybody came to the middle. And they knew moving the enterprise forward created accretive value for everyone in there. So I think we've lost a little bit of that.
Yeah.
And I think if we can get everybody back to the table with that mindset, that like access, if we're going to expand the college football playoff, which I don't know if we're going to do or not, I'm sure we're going to talk about it. If we're going to expand it, expansion needs to provide more access for everyone, not just for some over others. But I'm not worried. I think everybody's curious. But listen, we're having meetings, at our level too, to discuss the future and creating new properties and what we could potentially do. And I think everybody's just curious what everybody else is doing. Having said that, we're in the room together 10 times a year. And all it takes is a little sharing for everybody to get to the same place, because college football is the product. It's not Pac-12 football, American football, SEC football. College football is the product. And if we remember to just keep that at the middle of the table and build around it, then I think we have a real chance at this thing getting even bigger than it is. Because, is it strong? It's stronger than it's ever been. It's never been a time it's been this good.
There are some things that have been talked about in, I know you've talked about this a little bit, that like private equity 6 months ago, a year ago, people were going, no, that can't work. Now things are starting to come back up. Where are we headed? Yeah. What do you think's happening here?
Well, what I'm encouraged by, John, honestly, is that's another thing that I knew I was going to see when I got in, and it just hit me right in the face, is this general apathy or disregard to discuss change. Not to change, but just to talk about change. So when I came in, I knew at the American, because, this conference needs to do some things differently to further distinguish itself in the ecosystem, that we had to look at it like a business and look at it different. There's never been a business in the history of this country that hasn't had success, that hasn't taken outside capital to try to accelerate their success. So after a period of time where everyone was talking about how we, quote, we don't need that in our business, and we don't need people telling us what to do, and I don't see anything out there that we couldn't answer for ourselves, now everybody's exploring it. I am so encouraged by that, right? Because we need to look at things differently. Everybody's facing more daunting financial challenges in the future of this thing than ever before. I don't care what conference you are. Nobody has a straight answer for any of that. So exploring outside capital, I think, is really, really smart, because I was really lucky when I was at IMG. I got to be part of a couple of private capital deals, businesses that I was running that sold. And where outside investment gets attracted is to businesses that have massive affinity. I think we can check that box. Are growing at a significant clip. We can check that one. And sometimes could be run a little bit better. I definitely think we could check that one. So the beauty of private capital is your asset in a lot of conferences is your media rights contract. Instead of your institutions waiting every year for their portion of that, it'd be great to be able to accelerate that investment, give them that money to be able to invest in value creating enterprise now. So when we go back to the market for TV rights, you have a more valuable enterprise, and then everybody wins. The schools win, whoever accelerated you, the capital wins. It's almost like you treat them like a member. You take their investment and then they get a distribution every year, just like every other member. So I think this is going to happen. I don't think it's an if. I think it's a matter of who's going to do the first deal. And I'm fully expecting that the first one is going to be announced in the market in the next 30 to 60 days.
Wow. And do you think, what's the profile of a school that you think would be more likely to do it? Is it, lower end of the economic spectrum in Division I or in FBS, or is it at the higher end?
I don't think it matters. I think that if you ask the private capital partners that, I think they're looking to invest where they see brands and where they see, growth, like tried and true, consistent year over year growth. And I think that tends to trend towards the blue bloods a lot of the time. Having said all that, okay, every college and university's athletic department in the country is leaving money on the table in how they run their commercial business. And that's where I really think the opportunity is. I've said to a bunch of private capital partners that I've met, they've asked about schools. And I've always said I use my alma mater. I'm like, schools like Rutgers are the schools that need you guys, right? They need you to come in and evaluate how they run their business and figure out a way to create new commercial enterprise and upside and be able to, operate with more efficiency. So I think there's a place for it everywhere. But, naturally, the big names in private capital, they talk about the big brands because they see that as the most attractive because it has the biggest affinity.
And you're talking about, you keep saying private capital as opposed to private equity. And I assume that's on purpose, right?
Yeah, it is because, the word equity, I think, is scary to presidents sometimes, right? Because the word equity implies ownership and control. And that is not a thing that really resonates on college campuses, right? You will very rarely see a college campus turning over any ownership or any control of their operation. I say private capital because without getting into the 101, there's a lot of avenues to go. Private equity is expensive. Like the cost of accessing that capital is much higher than thinking about a private credit partnership or a debt partnership. Like there are other ways to access capital at a lower cost of capital where your return can be more reasonable and successful for everyone. In PE, the cost of capital is far greater, which makes the other side of that equation much harder to achieve.
Could you foresee a conference doing this, or do you see individual schools being more likely to make that leap?
Yeah, John, I like the way you think because that's the path, I think, the conference path. Individual institutions, depending on public or private, what some of the challenges they have are, board governance, like all that stuff makes it really, really hard. And when I started to go to the market on this on behalf of the American, what I've said to all the partners is I can bring you the whole membership at scale. And rather than being concerned about public records and what's out there and who's reading whose emails and the documents, whatever, we could do it at the conference level, because at the conference level, I have the greatest financeable asset, which is our media contract. So we have gotten a lot of interest in doing it at the conference level. And, I know for a fact other conferences are discussing it in the same fashion, like knowing you're going to have X amount of money coming in over a period of time. Here's your collateral to say, accelerate 10% of this investment now. Let us have it now. We'll work with you to create more value, and then we all win down the road. I think it's going to be a smoother path at the conference level rather than going door to door. I mean, you guys have been covering college sports forever, so you know this. Nobody wants to be first, right? But the minute somebody goes first, like everybody's hauling ass for the finish line. Everybody wants to be in the club. But at the conference level, you do give private capital partners the ability to work at scale. And I do think that is resonating with a lot of the folks that we've talked to.
Do you feel like your presidents in the American are open to being different, whether it's private capital or something else?
100%. Wilner, I would not have seriously pursued this if I didn't believe that. And, the first Zoom I had, I was running IMG Academy and I got the call and I thought, let me just take this call. And I met with the presidents on a Zoom, and when it was my time to ask questions, I said the following. I said, I'd like to know how willing you are to get crazy. And they're like, well, define crazy. And I said, taking outside investment, selling your naming rights to your conference, to a brand, jersey patches, like creating event, like how willing are you? And I spent a while drilling into these presidents in multiple meetings about this. But before I flew to Dallas for the final in person, I was feeling great and comfortable that they were ready. And a lot of the responses are like, yeah, we need to do stuff like that. How do we do it? So I know I have a group that has an appetite to do this stuff, because I don't, with due respect to you guys, autonomy, group of five, like, I don't read any of this crap. I think the media just made all this stuff up, but I know where we sit in the hierarchy. Like, we're not sitting with the autonomy conferences. And I would argue there's a gap between two of those and the other two. But I also know that, we're in a spot right now based on what happened in September, our performance in the football season, our performance in the postseason. We're sitting in a spot that's relatively unique of all conferences. And in order to stay there and be able to grow further and further in that spot, we need to do some things different. Like, doing it the traditional way in collegiate athletics is over. If this thing was innovated or modernized over the last 10 or 15 years, like, would we be talking about all this stuff that's going on? I would argue a lot of it could have been solved.
We talked about the Big Ten and the SEC. Do you feel like the group of five, or even those lower two Power Four conferences, do you think you guys need to come together a little bit? And as long as they're having a summit, is there a summit that's needed with the G5, or should the Pac-12 and the American and the Mountain West and the Big 12 and the ACC? I mean, you tell me where the synergy needs to be.
The answer to that, John, is 1,000% yes. And when I started in June, I actually hosted I reached out to all the group of five commissioners and hosted a meeting here in Dallas, right around the beginning of the football season. And we have another one coming up. And the answer to that is yes, there needs to be as much engagement as there humanly possibly can be. Part of it is, like, you have business to get done. Like, we have to actually figure out, like, mechanical things. There's a new CFP agreement, but the group of five hasn't actually landed on how the revenue is going to be distributed in that agreement. But we have stuff we actually have to get done. And then the flip side is, what does the future look like? What should we be developing? I know there was chatter about, should there be additional postseason games outside the CFP in the group of five, which some people think is a good idea and others don't. I might have floated that balloon out there just to sort of see which way the wind was blowing. But again, it's a good opportunity for that group to have more engagement and talk more about what we can be doing together and what we control, quite frankly. Like, early on, you guys said something to me like, are you worried? I tend not to worry about things I can't control, right? Do I think it's productive for, like, these two conferences are over there and these guys are over here and everybody's me? I don't think that's productive. I think that it'd be better for everyone to, even if we choke each other a little bit, to be in the room and have it out, because bringing the enterprise forward is what is in the best interest of all these kids that are out there that we represent. Like, all the media and a lot of people surrounding this and the so-called experts talk about, what do they talk about? NIL, money, transfer portal, expansion, more money. And I'm like, why is nobody talking about experience? Like, why is nobody talking about kids and experience? We have to get that back in focus. There's a way to do it, but it requires everyone. But your answer to your question is absolutely. Like, we did it at the beginning of the football season. We're doing it again this month. And I think that cadence needs to be consistent while we sort things out.
Tim, you mentioned September, and I'm curious what you thought of the Pac-12's moves, and were you ever concerned that the American was going to lose schools?
Oh, guys, look, I'd be lying if I said I wasn't worried, I'm not worried, but I wasn't concerned. Certainly when you're 100 days in to a job like this and something like that surfaces. And by the way, eyes open, I knew when I took the job that it was probably only a matter of months before something was going to, surface up and we were going to have to deal with it. So what did I think of it? I expected it. I don't know that I expected it from one conference or the other, but I expected it. Why? Historically, the American has been a breeding ground that has built strong programs that have moved into these conferences. So I expected that, like, we are always walking around with a target on our back. And that has a lot to do with the hard work and the investment that a lot of our schools have made. So I expected it. Certainly it was a chaotic couple of weeks, but I think as a commissioner, you have to make a really important decision at a time like that. And remember, I've never been a commissioner. I was 100 days on the job. But you can decide to do one of two things. You could either go into full sales mode and talk about why you're better and talk about why the other guy's no good or whatever it is. You can do that, okay? Or you can act more like a partner and a consultant. And that's what we chose to do. What we chose to do was say to our institutions, let's, the four that were being talked to and us, let's talk all the time. And my advice was, listen, like, people think I was upset about it. I wasn't upset about it. I worked at Rutgers. My job every day, like, we were a great member in the Big East, but my job every day at the end of the day was to do what was best for Rutgers, not for the Big East Conference. And that's why we ended up making that move. So institutions vetting what's out there to see what's best for their school, that's their job. I wasn't upset about it, but what we did was we made sure to surround those four schools with experts and expertise so they could separate fact from fiction and make sure they were dealing with, information that enabled them to make the decision. But at the end of the day, I had no chip in that game. Like, it wasn't my decision. So we chose to just make sure that they were well informed. And at the end of the day, I love how it played out. I love that the schools band together and made a joint statement about how committed they were. And the unity of this conference is actually a real thing right now. But I'm not a fool. Okay. I know, as long as conferences are thinking about the future and what's the future of my media rights and whatever, I fully expect, this is like hurricane season. Like, we had it in September and it's going to come back around. Like, it's inevitable and you can't predict when it's going to hit. So we just have to be prepared for it. But I was proud of how the league handled it. Like, if I could take you guys back, I remember seeing those four ADs sitting in rooms talking to each other about it and sharing information and, like, what did your offer say? And, what did this say? Because, they received actual offers to evaluate. But I was really proud of how they stuck together. And I think they made a decision that made total sense based on the information at the time. And I also know that then you got to turn around and face your fans. And sometimes fans don't dive deep enough to totally understand why you made the decision you made.
Tim, I was really impressed that you got on campus. I mean, you saw these people in person. Why was that important to you?
I learned it a long time ago, John. And I think because I'm old and, I tell my boys this, I have two young boys that work in sports now in their 20s, despite my better advice, but they work in sports. But I remember when I had my first job at ABC Sports, I worked across the hall from Tony, and I worked for a guy named Jon Wilner, who ran programming there for a long time. And, like, I didn't have a computer, and, like, you didn't have a cell phone. And I remember Jon Wilner saying to me, get on planes, get on campus, eat steak, play golf, smoke cigars. You got to get to know these guys. And I remember him saying this like it was yesterday, there will never be a substitute in good times or challenging times for face-to-face. And that's why I did it. And it's something that I've always kept with me. I heard it from him when I was 24 years old. I've always kept it with me. And I felt like there was a lot of narrative out there. Like, one of the visits I did plan while this was going on, but, like, Memphis, I had planned that a month earlier and planned to be there. So it was, like, perfect timing. But being face-to-face was meaningful. And then Lead One went on a week later while this was still going on. And we all got together at Lead One and we were in the room in person. It was just more productive to be able to look each other in the eye and be transparent. I think it's a lot easier to keep your cards closer when you're doing one of these and you're not in the room. So I just stuck to some advice I got when I was 24 years old from a great mentor of mine that has never failed me.
What is the grass is greener component of realignment as you see it, whether it's Rutgers in the Big Ten or, the West Coast schools where they are now, or the Americans, right? I mean, it always seems like the schools are chasing the money, but it doesn't always work out like they think, right? I mean, do you see that there's sometimes what's really important gets lost in the realignment craze?
I do, and it's easy for me to be critical of the craze, but I participated in it.
Yeah.
I was in a great conference. Like, I actually played when I was in college in the first ever Big East Conference football game. Like, that conference really meant something to me personally. And at the same time, it was business and not personal when we had that opportunity. I knew what we were doing. We felt like we were in a league where some schools played basketball and didn't play football. There wasn't a lot of alignment in the room on where we were headed as a league. And also, we didn't look like a lot of schools in that league. There was a lot of private institutions. And you looked at the Big Ten, you thought better fit, big public land grant AAUs, just like we were. But at the bottom of it was, I knew New York was going to deliver hundreds of millions in revenue to a conference with a distribution platform like the Big Ten Network. And knew, like, rule number one in expansion is you have to be able to pay for yourself and be able to provide enough value for everybody to earn more. And I knew we had the ability to do that day one. So yeah, it was about the finances. I also knew long-term the Big Ten was going to provide more financial stability and sustainability than the Big East Conference was. Nothing has changed. I think what everybody's doing is they're chasing more revenue and more resources to be able to try to get off university subsidy or now pay student athletes or revenue share or whatever it is. And that unfortunately gets lasered in focus, and other stuff, not that it's not important, but it gets left to the wayside. Like, think about student athletes now that are traveling across the country just to compete in conference competition. Like, is that the best case scenario for student athlete experience? Like, I don't think it is. And don't think I didn't share that. Like, when our schools asked me about, expansion opportunities, I said, make sure you spend some time and think about student athlete experience. And I told them the story. When I got Rutgers in the Big Ten, I was never more excited in my professional life. 4 nights later, I had a nightmare, a dream about the field hockey team on a bus broken down on the side of the road in the middle of the night coming back from Wisconsin. And I remember sitting up saying, oh my God, what did I do to these kids? And that was a geographically contiguous conference.
Yeah.
Right. But I think that's the one thing that's getting left aside. But listen, people are not only chasing more revenue, but they're chasing more exposure too, right? Because for your brand and for your profile, exposure has never been more important. And I think those things get put into focus, which, by the way, is fine as long as you're focusing on everything that's important.
You're talking about the athlete experience. Do you think the players need a union? Do athletes need to unionize to have a voice in this, or can they trust the conferences and schools to take care of them?
What I would tell, and I tell every student athlete this, John, when I go on campuses, is, I think there's skepticism. Like, hey, what are you commissioners? Like, what do you guys do? And what I always say is, like, being in the commissioner's room would be a fun, reality show for everybody to see. Because, you got a lot of interesting personalities. But despite popular belief, you got a lot of people in that room that care deeply about getting it right. And you have a lot of people in that room that were student athletes in college, where the experience was really meaningful and honestly shaped them into who they are as people. Like, I know mine did. But this is what I think. Student athletes should have a voice in this. Should they be employees? I don't think so. Should they be able to unionize? Like, to me, I think the right solution to evaluate is there a way for them to be able to organize and collectively bargain without being employees? Right. And I think everybody's a little wary of that, a little afraid of it. But when I look at coaches out there negotiating 60 different deals with players, I'm saying to myself, like, don't you want to get back to coaching? Like, because we're taking time away from the job we actually hired these people to do because of the chaos of, like, oh, Tim, I can't meet Thursday night. I know you're coming on campus. I got to swing by this bar to pick up like a check for the collective. So coaches are officially sort of at a different level, but student athletes should have a voice. It's their future. And at the same time, if we could figure out a way to get them together to collectively bargain without being employees, because I don't actually think they want to be employees, I think that would be something worth a closer look.
Tim, the CFP meetings are, I don't know, there's late February, I think it is. Don't know the exact
end of February.
End of February. What are you expecting to happen? You think that there's going to be changes for next season, or you think any changes might wait till the next contract cycle?
John, I know we're going to discuss change.
Yeah.
And again, like I said it before, when we talk about change, I feel like we're growing up a little bit, and like we're evolving. So I know we're going to talk about change. The thing that the group did really, really well, like the first meeting I got to sit in even before I started was in April, and everybody agreed, like, hey, before we get nuts about talking about what should change, let's get all the way through the competitive cycle and see how this thing goes. It's like, this is our first, we're taking this 12-team thing out for a spin for the first time.
Right.
Let's get all the way through. And to everybody's credit, they did that. And now we have a lot of data and information to look at. But, certainly it's hard to predict, and I don't have a feel on whether or not we're going to be talking about things changing immediately versus in 26, because you talk about things changing immediately, like, it's February.
Yeah.
Football season's not that far off. So there's a lot of logistics to go on into this. But talking about all the things you read about, like, will we talk about, the seating? Will we talk about the on-campus games? Will we talk about the number of teams, and the format? I know there's people out there saying, well, are they going to start talking about automatic qualifiers,
Yeah.
based on conference. I'm sure that all this stuff, will get discussed. And whether it changes or not, to me, is not relevant. I think the fact that we're all in there talking about it is good and it's healthy. The one thing that I've said, because I keep getting asked about, well, what if? Like, I can't do what ifs, right? If it's real, I'll deal with it. But what if? And the answer is always the same. Expansion of the NCAA tournament, what if? Okay. If expansion of the NCAA tournament enables us to get more revenue from TV partners for the NCAA tournament and provides more access for everyone, it's got my vote.
Right.
But if it provides more access for some instead of others, it doesn't have my vote. So as you look at the postseason in football, I don't think anybody is claiming that all of these conferences are competing on the same level, but there is an element of that you don't want to eliminate. Why do people love the NCAA tournament? Because St. Peter's, a school from up the street where I grew up in New Jersey, can go to the Sweet 16. There is still, while that might be harder in college football, it's still possible. And the stories you don't expect and the excitement of those stories and the possibilities is what makes the game great. Like in our league, Army last year, nobody saw that coming. Literally nobody saw that coming.
Yeah.
But that's what people love. So as we think about expanding the playoff, so long as it provides more access for everyone, it's a worthwhile conversation.
There's been talk about a czar or a commissioner for college athletics. Is that a good idea in your mind, to have somebody over the top kind of being a unifier, looking out for the good of the game? And if so, where does the opposition come to that idea? If there's, who could be against the good of the game?
Well, I vote for you two guys as co-commissioners of that thing. All right. The Canzano and Wilner show. Yeah. I mean, you guys basically know everybody anyway. So that's a hard one, John, just because one of the challenges I think that we currently have with how the system is set up, like I said, is like the product is college football, but it's been sort of separated out where everybody appears to be running their own enterprise, which again is fine, but it's got to come together on the really important stuff. Being able to get every conference on board with something like that, or to adopt a system like that, which is going to mean they're going to have to concede, some things in order to be able to make it work, I think will be really challenging. But the idea of going back to what I said earlier, what is the product? Like, if you put the product at the center, then you would argue that having somebody caretaking that product and looking out for it and doing the global thinking about that product all the time is, again, it's different, it's innovative, it's change. What's the harm in talking about it?
Tim, before we let you go, we ask all our guests if they could kind of recount the best piece of advice, either professional or personal, that they have received. You got something?
Best piece of advice. That's a good one. Yeah, that's a good one. I've always I have a bunch from a lot of the people that I've worked with, and by the way, I've written down a lot of stuff to remind myself never, to do some of those things. Like, you pick up good and bad. But my one piece of advice is no matter what industry you work in or what you do, invest in people. Like, it's easy to run your business and to make decisions and to do it in a very mechanical, tactical way. But if you don't invest in people and invest in relationships, nothing works, especially in sports. You guys know this from covering what you cover. I mean, is there a bigger relationship business on the planet than collegiate athletics? Like, I don't think there is. I've been around a lot of other ones. So my advice is invest in relationships and people. And by the way, don't pick up the phone and call them only when you need something. It's fine to engage and invest and get to know people on a personal level, because then when the business comes to the table, it's remarkable how much less challenging it is to get things over the line.
Yeah,
Tim, thank you. Really appreciate your time, expertise. A lot to think about, man. A lot, and it's never a dull moment, I'm sure, in your life.
It's not, but it's a lot of fun, and that's really why I came back, because this thing means something to me. Like, it changed me when I was 18 years old. And listen, I say this with all seriousness. I follow you guys and your stuff, and I was flattered to be asked to be part of it. And whenever you find yourself strapped for C-level talent, you know who to call.
Thanks,
so
Tim.
We will be in touch. Thanks so much. We will come back to you maybe before the season, because by then everything will be different. So we can talk about
anytime, guys.
Yeah.
Thanks again.
so much.
Thank you. Take care, man.
Take care.
There he goes, Wilner. Really good stuff, man. Let's unpack it. First of all, I mean, no better guest who, this is a guy who has been in it as an athlete.
Yep.
Been in it as an administrator, been on the business side of it, been on the media side of it, and now is in the commissioner seat. Very interesting amalgam of his career to end up in as commissioner of the American. And as he was talking about that czar of college football, I was like, why not Tim Pernetti?
Well,
put him in that seat.
He's got a lot of the qualities you look for. When you hear about the czar thing, Nick Saban, so-and-so coaches, it can't be, if there is one, it's not going to be a coach. It's got to be somebody like Tim who understands the business side, the media side, and can work the back room with relationships like that. You know what? When he was talking about it's all about relationships, that piece of advice, I kept thinking about the Pac-12, the old Pac-12, and how that was missed. So that component was missed so badly at the conference office with the campuses, and how it might have been different if there had been relationships, if commissioners had gotten on airplanes and met face to face, if they'd had a level of trust with the campuses that didn't exist. That was really good advice for sure.
Yeah. Well, he held those schools together by getting them in the room together and looking them in the eye, and at least in the short term, and on that salvo from the Pac-12, and the Pac-12 may want to play a semantics game and say, hey, look, it was just an initial term sheet. We were trying to open a bigger conversation. It's clear that the American schools took one look at it and went, nope, we're with Tim for now.
Yeah. And it's interesting how he explained his whole mindset about that. You could either be a salesman or a consultant, and he went into consulting mode. And what he said meshes with, what I heard in real time, which was he was very much an honest broker trying to lay out the finances, lay out the strategy for his schools, and then just let them decide. He didn't get defensive when the time came, and that probably played a big role in them sticking together.
Yeah, some of these conferences don't know who they are, but the American does. The American knows. Even under Mike Oresco, his predecessor, there was a real piece they had about saying, hey, look, you have a chance to join a Power Four. Go with our blessing. We'll take you to the airport, so to speak. But the American knows who it is. And I'm curious now, watching the Mountain West, watching the Pac-12, even watching the Big 12 and the ACC, do these conferences, are they able to look in the mirror and accurately see what they are, who they are at this time and place in college athletics? And I don't think they all have an accurate assessment. No,
that's a great point. And the American, like you said, they pride themselves under Oresco, especially. Yeah, if you got a school that the big boys want, go on, move on up. We understand. Yeah. It's almost pride in being part of the pipeline, right? Like a coach who has a lot of assistant coaches and coordinators go on to become head coaches. Coaching tree. The American has kind of been a conference tree, and that's a good, healthy enterprise if that's what you're doing.
Yeah. Look, by the way, if we're appointing a czar of college football, somebody like Tim Pernetti, I think there's a board of directors underneath that's got the Chris Peterson, Nick Saban, David Shaw flavor to it. And then maybe like an athletic director, somebody like Jen Cohen, who's at USC, that you put in there, is, people who care about the sport, care about the athletes, care about the game. That would be part of that structure. But I think you're going to have a hard time getting the Big Ten and the SEC right now to see that unless those lower conference teams band together and create some leverage. So we shall see how that unfolds. Make sure that you are subscribed to this podcast. Make a commitment to us and leave us feedback. Share it with your friends and family. If you're watching on YouTube, hit that subscribe button. We'll be back next week with an all-new episode.
Thanks, everybody.